The medieval castle, with its imposing towers and formidable walls, represents one of humanity's most enduring architectural achievements. These structures served as military fortifications, administrative centers, and symbols of feudal power throughout Europe from approximately the 9th to the 16th centuries. However, behind a romanticized image of chivalrous knights and noble lords lay a harsh reality of daily life that required extensive maintenance and sanitation systems to function. Among the most essential yet reviled positions within castle society was that of the garderobe cleaner, an individual whose responsibilities centered around maintaining the castle's primitive toilet facilities. The garderobe, derived from the French term meaning to guard the robe, initially referred to a small chamber where valuable clothing and personal items were stored. The name evolved to encompass the castle's toilet facilities because these chambers often served dual purposes, with the belief that the ammonia from human waste would repel moths and other insects that might damage stored fabrics. This dual function represents the pragmatic approach medieval society took toward space utilization within castle walls, where every room served multiple purposes out of necessity. Medieval castles typically featured multiple garderobes strategically positioned throughout the structure. These facilities consisted of simple stone seats with holes cut through them, positioned over vertical shafts that extended from the upper levels down to the castle's foundation or directly to the outside walls. The waste would fall through these shafts, sometimes into moats, rivers, or specially constructed pits known as cesspits. The architectural design varied considerably depending on the castle's location, available water sources, and the wealth of its inhabitants. The position of garderobe cleaner emerged as a necessary occupation due to the inherent problems with these primitive sanitation systems. Unlike modern plumbing systems that rely on water pressure and gravity to efficiently transport waste away from living areas, medieval garderobes were entirely dependent on gravity alone. This meant that solid waste, cloth scraps used for cleaning, and other debris frequently accumulated within the shafts, creating blockages that could render the entire system unusable. The social status of the garderobe cleaner within medieval castle hierarchy was among the lowest possible. Medieval society operated under a rigid feudal system where social mobility was extremely limited and occupations were often hereditary. Those who worked in direct contact with human waste were considered part of the most degraded social class, often grouped with other unclean professions such as tanners, butchers, and gravediggers. This social stigma extended beyond the workplace, affecting every aspect of the cleaner's life, including marriage prospects, living arrangements, and interaction with other castle inhabitants. The daily responsibilities of a garderobe cleaner began before dawn and continued well into the evening hours. The primary task involved the manual removal of accumulated waste from the garderobe shafts. This process required the cleaner to access narrow, poorly ventilated spaces using primitive tools such as long-handled scoops, buckets, and ropes. The work was performed in complete darkness or with minimal lighting from candles or oil lamps, adding significant danger to an already hazardous occupation. The physical demands of this work were extraordinary. Garderobe cleaners needed to navigate cramped spaces, often requiring them to crawl through narrow passages or descend into deep pits using rope ladders or crude scaffolding systems. The accumulated waste could reach considerable depths, particularly in larger castles with multiple levels of garderobes feeding into the same shaft. Cleaners frequently had to work in spaces barely wide enough for an adult human body, while handling heavy buckets of waste material that needed to be hauled to the surface using pulley systems or carried by hand through winding castle passages. The health hazards associated with this occupation were severe and numerous. Constant exposure to human waste exposed garderobe cleaners to a wide array of diseases and infections. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was primitive, with no knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or the importance of sanitation in preventing illness. Cleaners regularly suffered from gastrointestinal infections, respiratory problems caused by inhaling toxic gases, and skin conditions resulting from direct contact with waste materials. The confined spaces in which garderobe cleaners worked presented additional health risks. The accumulation of methane and hydrogen sulfide gases in poorly ventilated shafts could cause suffocation, unconsciousness, or death. These gases, produced by the decomposition of organic waste, were invisible and largely odorless at dangerous concentrations, making them particularly treacherous. Historical records from various medieval sources document instances of workers becoming overcome by these gases and requiring rescue, though many such incidents likely went unrecorded. The tools available to medieval garderobe cleaners were primitive by any standard. Long-handled wooden scoops, leather buckets reinforced with metal bands, and coarse rope represented the extent of available equipment. These tools were crude and inefficient, requiring enormous physical effort to accomplish even basic cleaning tasks. The wooden implements absorbed odors and bacteria, becoming increasingly unsanitary with repeated use. Metal tools were expensive and often unavailable to those in such lowly positions, forcing cleaners to make do with whatever materials they could obtain or fashion themselves. Working conditions varied significantly depending on the season and weather. During winter months, the accumulated waste in garderobe shafts would freeze solid, making removal extremely difficult and requiring the use of primitive chiseling tools to break apart frozen masses. The cold also made the work more physically demanding, as cleaners had to perform strenuous labor while wearing inadequate clothing and dealing with the additional challenge of icy surfaces within the castle's stone passages. Summer presented different, but equally challenging conditions. High temperatures accelerated decomposition processes, intensifying odors and increasing the concentration of toxic gases within garderobe shafts. The heat also promoted the growth of bacteria and attracted increased populations of insects and vermin, creating additional health hazards and making the work environment even more unpleasant. The compensation provided to garderobe cleaners was minimal, reflecting their low social status and the general medieval attitude toward manual labor. Payment typically consisted of basic food provisions, simple clothing, and rudimentary shelter within the castle's servant quarters. Monetary wages, when provided at all, were among the lowest paid to any castle worker. This economic reality meant that garderobe cleaners lived in perpetual poverty, with no opportunity for advancement or improvement in their circumstances. The social isolation experienced by garderobe cleaners extended beyond mere occupational stigma. Medieval society placed enormous importance on concepts of cleanliness and purity, particularly within religious contexts. Those who worked with human waste were considered ritually unclean and were often prohibited from participating in certain religious ceremonies or entering specific areas of the castle or surrounding communities. This social exclusion reinforced their marginal status and limited their opportunities for forming relationships or integrating into broader castle society. Living conditions for garderobe cleaners were typically squalid, even by medieval standards. They were often housed in the most undesirable areas of the castle, such as chambers near the kitchen heat sources, storage areas with poor ventilation, or spaces adjacent to the very facilities they were employed to maintain. These quarters were small, poorly furnished, and offered little privacy or comfort. The persistent odors associated with their work meant that even their personal living spaces became contaminated, making escape from the unpleasant aspects of their occupation impossible. The psychological impact of this occupation was profound. The combination of social isolation, dangerous working conditions, and the inherently degrading nature of the work created significant mental health challenges. Medieval society provided no understanding of or resources for addressing psychological distress, leaving garderobe cleaners to cope with depression, anxiety, and social alienation without support. The knowledge that their position was likely permanent, with little hope for change or advancement, further contributed to psychological distress. Family life for garderobe cleaners was severely impacted by their occupation. The social stigma associated with their work extended to family members, limiting marriage prospects and social opportunities for their children. In many cases, the occupation became hereditary not by choice but by necessity, as few other opportunities were available to the children of those in such degraded positions. This created generational cycles of poverty and social exclusion that were extremely difficult to break. The relationship between garderobe cleaners and other castle inhabitants was characterized by a complex mixture of necessity and revulsion. While their services were absolutely essential for maintaining basic sanitation and preventing disease outbreaks, they were simultaneously viewed with disgust and treated as social pariahs. This paradox created a tense dynamic where garderobe cleaners were both indispensable and unwelcome, leading to interactions marked by minimal communication and maximum social distance. The technical aspects of garderobe maintenance required specialized knowledge that was passed down through informal apprenticeship systems. New garderobe cleaners, often children or desperate individuals with no other options, learned their trade through direct observation and hands-on experience under the guidance of more experienced workers. This knowledge encompassed understanding the castle's specific waste management system, recognizing signs of structural problems in garderobe shafts, and developing techniques for safely working in hazardous environments. Medieval castle construction presented unique challenges for waste management systems. The thick stone walls that provided defensive capabilities also created complex internal structures with multiple levels, winding passages, and intersecting chambers. Garderobe shafts needed to navigate these architectural obstacles while maintaining proper drainage and ventilation. Understanding the layout of these systems was crucial for effective cleaning, as blockages in one area could affect the functionality of garderobes throughout the castle. The seasonal nature of garderobe cleaning work created additional complications. During periods of heavy rainfall, water infiltration could flood garderobe shafts, creating dangerous working conditions and complicating waste removal efforts. Conversely, during dry periods, the lack of natural water flow meant that waste accumulated more rapidly and became more difficult to remove. These seasonal variations required garderobe cleaners to adapt their techniques and schedules accordingly. The relationship between garderobe cleaners and castle medical practices was complex and often contradictory. While medieval medicine was primitive by modern standards, castle physicians and healers recognized the connection between poor sanitation and disease outbreaks. However, this understanding did not translate into improved working conditions or protection for garderobe cleaners. Instead, they were often viewed as necessary but dangerous individuals who might spread disease to other castle inhabitants, leading to further social isolation and discriminatory treatment. Medieval record-keeping practices provide limited direct documentation of garderobe cleaner experiences, as their low social status meant their activities were rarely considered worthy of detailed recording. However, indirect evidence from castle maintenance records, legal documents, and contemporary accounts of castle life provides insight into their circumstances. These sources reveal that garderobe cleaning was recognized as essential work that required regular performance to maintain castle functionality. The economic impact of effective garderobe maintenance extended beyond simple sanitation concerns. Castles served as administrative and commercial centers, hosting important visitors, conducting diplomatic meetings, and managing extensive agricultural and trade operations. Dysfunctional sanitation systems could compromise these activities, potentially affecting the castle's reputation and economic viability. This economic importance, however, did not translate into improved compensation or working conditions for garderobe cleaners. Technological limitations of the medieval period meant that improvements to garderobe systems were minimal throughout most of the era. The lack of understanding of hydraulic engineering, limited availability of water pressure systems, and absence of chemical cleaning agents meant that manual cleaning remained the primary method of maintenance. Some later medieval castles incorporated more sophisticated drainage systems or water sources for flushing, but these improvements were rare and typically available only to the wealthiest castle owners. The geographic location of castles significantly influenced the working conditions and challenges faced by garderobe cleaners. Castles built near rivers or other water sources could utilize natural water flow for waste disposal, potentially reducing the accumulation of solid waste in garderobe shafts. However, This also meant that cleaners might need to work in areas with water infiltration, creating muddy, slippery, and potentially dangerous conditions. Castles in dry regions faced different challenges, with waste accumulation being more problematic, but working conditions potentially less hazardous from a drowning perspective. The military nature of many medieval castles added another dimension to the challenges faced by garderobe cleaners. During times of siege or warfare, maintaining sanitation systems became even more critical as large numbers of people were confined within castle walls for extended periods. However, these same conditions made garderobe cleaning more dangerous, as enemy forces might target waste disposal areas or attempt to infiltrate the castle through garderobe shafts. Historical accounts document instances of military attacks conducted through these sanitation systems, highlighting the security vulnerabilities they created. The relationship between garderobe cleaners and castle chaplains or religious authorities was often strained due to medieval religious concepts of cleanliness and sin. Many religious interpretations associated physical uncleanliness with moral corruption, creating theological justifications for the social exclusion of those who worked with human waste. This religious dimension added another layer of social stigma and limited opportunities for spiritual comfort or community support. Training and skill development for garderobe cleaners occurred entirely through informal methods, as no formal educational institutions or guild systems existed for such low-status occupations. New workers learned essential skills through trial and error, observation of experienced cleaners, and gradual accumulation of practical knowledge. This included developing physical techniques for working in confined spaces, understanding the structural layout of specific castle systems, and recognizing dangerous situations that might require evacuation or assistance. The long-term health consequences of garderobe cleaning work were severe and typically resulted in shortened lifespans. Constant exposure to disease-causing organisms, toxic gases, and physically demanding working conditions took cumulative tolls on workers' health. Many garderobe cleaners developed chronic respiratory problems, digestive disorders, and joint problems from working in cramped positions. The lack of medical care available to individuals of their social status meant that these health problems went untreated, leading to progressive deterioration and premature death. Child labor was unfortunately common in garderobe cleaning operations, as small children could more easily navigate narrow shafts and passages that were difficult for adults to access. These children faced all the same health and safety hazards as adult workers while being even more vulnerable to the physical and psychological impacts of such work. The use of child labor in garderobe cleaning represents one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval castle sanitation systems. The disposal of waste removed from garderobe systems presented additional challenges and health hazards. The waste needed to be transported away from the castle and disposed of in locations where it would not contaminate water sources or create public health problems. This transportation process exposed garderobe cleaners to additional risks and required them to venture outside castle walls, where they might face hostility from local populations who viewed them as sources of disease and contamination. Alternative employment opportunities for those working as garderobe cleaners were extremely limited due to their social stigma and lack of transferable skills. The specialization required for their work did not translate to other occupations, and their association with human waste made them unwelcome in most other forms of employment. This economic reality trapped individuals and families in cycles of poverty and social exclusion that were nearly impossible to escape. The evolution of medieval castle design over time did not significantly improve conditions for garderobe cleaners until the very late medieval period. While castle architecture became more sophisticated in many respects, sanitation systems remained primitive throughout most of the era. Only in the final centuries of medieval castle construction did some innovations in waste management begin to appear, often influenced by contact with more advanced systems encountered during the Crusades or through trade with other cultures. The legacy of medieval garderobe cleaning extends beyond historical curiosity to provide important insights into social stratification, occupational hazards, and the human costs of primitive sanitation systems. The experiences of these workers illustrate the extreme inequalities that characterized medieval society and the ways in which essential but undesirable work was relegated to the most vulnerable members of society. Understanding their circumstances provides valuable perspective on the development of sanitation systems, occupational safety measures, and social protections that modern societies often take for granted. The documentation and study of medieval garderobe cleaning practices also contribute to our understanding of castle archaeology, medieval daily life, and the practical challenges of maintaining large residential complexes in pre-industrial societies. This knowledge informs historical research, archaeological interpretation, and public understanding of medieval life beyond the romanticized images often portrayed in popular culture. The harsh realities faced by garderobe cleaners serve as important reminders of the human costs associated with technological limitations and rigid social hierarchies that characterized much of human history.